Welcome back to Geopolitea. My name is Tanya and I spill tea on all the international news that you might have missed. And there's a lot today, so without wasting any time, let's get into it. So first up, we've got Seychelles and Micronesia becoming diplomatic partners on August 19th, 2026. And that basically means that they officially recognized each other as countries that they want to have a formal relationship with, in things like cooperation, trade, climate issues, and working together at the UN. So the Federated States of Micronesia, or FSM, is a very small country made up of 4 island states and hundreds of islands in the Pacific. So at first glance, Micronesia and Seychelles sound like a completely random pairing because first of all, they are thousands of kilometers apart and they don't really have much of an obvious economic relationship. But they do have something in common. Both are small island states dealing with the same vulnerabilities like climate change, rising sea levels, economic dependence on the ocean, and limited influence individually. So their new diplomatic relationship makes sense on one level, that they can work together internationally, particularly on climate and development issues. But then there's also the geopolitics, because Micronesia sits in one of the most contested parts of the Pacific. It has a very close security relationship with the US. Under the Compact of Free Association, the US is responsible for FSM's defense and security. But FSM is still a sovereign country and controls its own foreign policy. And that matters because the Pacific has become a major arena for US-China competition as well. Because China has also been expanding its diplomatic and economic presence across Pacific island states, while the US is trying to maintain its strategic position in the region. And then there's Taiwan as well. Several Pacific countries have switched diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to China in recent years. Even FSM itself recognizes China and not Taiwan. So Micronesia is already operating in this very complicated space. But it does not have the power of the US or China. But it can build relationships with both and with other small states and use those relationships to create more diplomatic leverage of its own. Next up, we've got Rwanda acting as a migration messiah. Because Rwanda has become a country that richer countries are willing to pay to handle some of their migration problems. Instead of a country like the UK or US dealing with certain asylum seekers or deported migrants entirely on its own, the idea is that we'll send them to Rwanda and Rwanda will take care of them. And this is called externalization of migration. But why Rwanda? Because Rwanda has deliberately presented itself as a country that can safely host migrants and refugees. It already had experience doing this. In 2019, Rwanda worked with UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, to take people who were trapped in terrible conditions in detention centers in Libya. They would receive things like medical care and other support while their cases were processed before either returning to their home countries or being resettled elsewhere. Then in 2022, the UK government came up with a very different and highly controversial idea. The UK was dealing with people arriving irregularly across the English Channel, especially on small boats. So the British government solution was essentially that instead of allowing these asylum seekers to remain in Britain while their cases are dealt with, we'll send some of them to Rwanda. And the important part is that Rwanda was not merely going to process their applications and send them back to Britain. They could potentially stay in Rwanda permanently, and Britain was going to pay Rwanda for that. But almost nobody was actually sent. Legal challenges in Britain repeatedly blocked deportation flights. Then in 2024, a new British government came to power under Keir Starmer. And Starmer's government abandoned the Rwanda scheme. So Britain had spent hundreds of millions of pounds on a program that resulted in almost no people actually being relocated. But there's a bigger geopolitical story. Even though the UK deal failed, Rwanda gained something else, a reputation. It became known internationally as a country willing to receive migrants on behalf of wealthy Western governments. So now in 2026, Italy proposed that European Union create return hubs. Basic idea is similar only. Instead of keeping some migrants in Europe while their immigration or asylum cases are dealt with, European countries could potentially transfer them to facilities in third countries. Italy was already experimenting with this model through its controversial arrangement with Albania, where Italy established centers to process certain migrants outside Italian territory. Now it was suggesting that the EU could create similar arrangement with other countries, and Rwanda was one of the countries being discussed. And even the US entered the picture. In 2025, the United States reached its own arrangement with Rwanda. Under the agreement, Rwanda can receive up to 250 migrants deported from the US. So you see the pattern. It's about a new way wealthy countries are trying to manage migration. But of course, there is a major controversy. Human rights organizations and UNHCR have warned that these arrangements can create serious risks. Because the concern is what happens if someone is sent to Rwanda and then eventually sent somewhere else dangerous. So Rwanda says that it respects this principle and does not forcibly return asylum seekers to danger. Rwanda successfully positioned itself as a country saying that if wealthy countries want to move part of their migration problem outside their borders, we're willing to talk. Next up, we've got this small country, Moldova, being stuck in the Russia-Ukraine war in ways that you can't even imagine. First of all, where is Moldova? Moldova is a small country between Ukraine and Romania, and that geography matters because of Odessa, which is one of Ukraine's most important cities and ports, which is extremely close to Moldova. Since Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Moldova has repeatedly found missile fragments and drone debris on its territory, and it has also reported unauthorized airspace violations. But August 2026 marked a more serious escalation. A Russian combat drone crashed or exploded on Moldovan territory carrying components associated with guided missile technology, and Moldova responded by recalling its ambassador from Moscow. But the physical spillover is only the most visible part of the problem. Russia is also trying to maintain political influence inside Moldova. Why? Because Moldova has been moving steadily towards the European Union. It applied for EU membership in 2022, became a candidate and began accession negotiations. For Moscow, Moldova moving firmly into the European sphere means losing a country that has historically been within Russia's orbit. And Russia doesn't necessarily need to invade Moldova to make that harder. It can use disinformation, political interference, cyber attacks, economic pressure, support for pro-Russian groups, and pressure through Moldova's separatist regions. And Moldova already has one, Transnistria. Transnistria is a breakaway region internationally recognized as part of Moldova, but it has operated separately since the early 1990s, and Russia has troops stationed there. So Russia already has a military presence inside Moldova's internationally recognized borders. And that makes Transnistria more than just a separatist dispute. It gives Moscow an existing foothold from which it can exert political and security pressure on Moldova as the country moves towards the EU. And that foothold has an economic weakness: energy. Transnistria depended heavily on Russian gas. When Russian gas transit through Ukraine stopped in early 2025, the region faced a major energy crisis. The region needed huge amounts of gas simply to keep its heating system functioning. So energy became another source of leverage. And this is why the biggest concern is not necessarily that Russia will invade Moldova tomorrow. The more complicated scenario is a political crisis. Transnistria itself is weakening. Its population and economy have been declining, which creates a strategic question for Russia. If its influence continues weakening, Transnistria could eventually move closer to reintegration with Moldova. But if Moscow wants to preserve its foothold, it could instead double down, making Transnistria more dependent on Russia and potentially more militarized also. And that is exactly why the EU is paying attention, because for Brussels, Moldova is not simply a small country dealing with some stray drones. It is an EU candidate trying to integrate with Europe while facing Russian military spillover, energy pressure, and a Russian-backed separatist region. So the EU has been increasing security assistance to Moldova because protecting Moldova's stability is increasingly connected to protecting its European integration. But Moldova's stability also matters directly to Ukraine, because Transnistria sits on Ukraine's western border, very close to Odessa. And if Russia were able to significantly increase its military presence there, Ukraine could potentially face another security problem on its western flank while already fighting Russia in the east and south. So Moldova is sitting at the intersection of three competing interests. Russia wants to preserve its influence, EU wants Moldova to integrate with Europe, and Ukraine needs Moldova to remain stable because of Odessa and the Black Sea. And Moldova is trying to navigate all three while living next to an active war zone. Canada and USA are going through a trade war that could completely change North American economy. So Canada and US are deeply economically connected. Canada sends a huge share of its exports to the American market, while American companies rely on Canadian resources, components, and raw materials. So for decades, this relationship had basically worked like one giant economic machine. Canada supplies, US manufacturers, and both sell into the North American market. But that relationship is now under serious pressure because since returning to office, Donald Trump has been using tariffs and access to the US market as leverage over Canada. Mark Carney's government had been negotiating with Washington to reduce those tariffs, but on August 21st, Canada walked away from the talks. And according to Carney, the US had made new demands at the last minute, including restrictions affecting Canada's ability to negotiate trade deals with other countries and issues involving Canadian language and culture. So Canada's position was basically that this is not just about tariffs anymore. You're asking us to change how we conduct our own domestic affairs. But the US tells a very different story. USTR Jamieson Greer said that Canada had refused to finalize terms that Washington believed had already been agreed to. So the two sides don't even agree on why the negotiations collapsed. The US imposed 50% tariffs on around $20 billion worth of Canadian goods. Now Canada says that it will respond dollar for dollar, but this is bigger than another tariff dispute. Because Canada is now asking a much more uncomfortable question. Because Canada has spent decades building supply chains around the US. I mean, you can't replace that relationship overnight. So when Washington makes Canadian goods more expensive, then Canadian businesses suffer. But American manufacturers can also face higher costs, and that is happening right now. And that is why this is not simply Canada versus America. It is two economies that are deeply integrated, trying to use that integration as leverage against each other. So Canada is obviously going to look elsewhere, and it has. Carney has been pushing for stronger economic relationships with China, Europe, and other markets. But of course, diversification takes years. You need new customers, supply chains, infrastructure, and trade agreements. And there's USMCA also. It's a trade agreement between the US, Canada, and Mexico that replaced NAFTA. Its 6-year review began in 2026, meaning that the current tariff fight is happening alongside a much bigger issue. What happens to North American economic integration itself? Will the three countries preserve one integrated trading system, or will it slowly become a US-Canada, US-Mexico thing instead of one North American economic bloc? So Canada isn't saying that it can stop doing business with America. It's being realistic. It's saying that we still need the US, but we don't want to be completely dependent on it. And that is exactly what countries like India and many other European countries are trying to emphasize. Next up, we've got a new economic corridor between Solomon Islands and PNG. So PNG and Solomon Islands are both Melanesian Pacific countries. So they have strong cultural and people-to-people connections. And there are already 50 plus PNG companies operating in Solomon Islands in banking, telecom, transport, agriculture, hotels, etc. So this is not the two countries are suddenly discovering each other. The informal relationship already existed. But now the two governments are trying to turn that into an actual economic corridor involving businesses, investment, flights, trade, mining, fisheries, and easier movement of goods as well as people. So they have now started building the formal structure for this. But Solomon Islands needs this because it is becoming more dependent on mining. Mining went from just 4% of its export in 2019 to more than half today. And there is another problem. Around 9,000 young people enter the workforce every year, but only about 2,100 formal jobs are being created. So the government needs new investment, new industries, and more jobs. And PNG is attractive because it's a much larger economy and has experience in areas like mining and resource development. And obviously, this is not happening in an empty Pacific. Like I said, Pacific Islands have increasingly becoming an area of competition between China, United States, and even Australia. And Solomon Islands is particularly important because its previous government moved closer to China, including signing a controversial security agreement with Beijing in 2022. And that made Australia and the US very nervous. But now there is a new government under Prime Minister Matthew Whale, which is being seen as more interested in balancing or reducing China's influence. So instead of Solomon Islands leaning on China or PNG leaning on Australia or US, they both are choosing to build stronger economic relationships with each other. That's all the tea for today, but make sure to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any more Geopolitea.